You're listening to Just Medicine, an equity in healthcare podcast created by medical students in British Columbia.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Just Medicine podcast. My name is Kennedy, and I'm a first-year medical student at the University of British Columbia. I am super excited to bring you the second episode in a 4-part podcast series that focuses on the power of food in healthy and culturally appropriate diets for Indigenous populations to facilitate a healthy gut microbiome. I'll repeat that one more time because I think it provides an important foundation to help us contextualize the information coming in this episode. So again, this series focuses on the power of food in healthy and culturally appropriate diets for Indigenous populations in order to facilitate a healthy gut microbiome. In our first episode, I had a fantastic conversation with Jessie Newman, an Indigenous health dietitian on Vancouver Island. This conversation gave a really great background on the importance of foods and food systems in Indigenous communities, as well as how diets are changing through time. We also discussed some of the adverse health and social outcomes that have disproportionately affected Indigenous communities through generations since colonization. If you haven't listened yet and you're interested to learn more, I highly recommend you go check out that episode. But for today, we're building on that conversation with Dr. Estello Nap Hill, a gastroenterology fellow who attended UBC Medical School with specific expertise in the gut microbiome. Together, we'll discuss the composition and factors that shape the gut microbiome and how microbes in more traditional hunter-gatherer diets differ from Westernized diets. 95% of the viruses, fungi, and bacteria in the body are found in the gut and exist in symbiosis with the human host, contributing to homeostasis, regulating immune function, metabolism, and influencing mental health. The presence of specific organisms depends on exposures to nature versus sanitary environments, the vaginal canal in vaginal delivery, medications, diet, and more. In our conversation, Dr. Nap Hill emphasizes the role of lifestyle and upbringing, factors that we can more or less control, over the role of genetics in gut microbiome development. Highlighting the value of a diverse, whole food, plant-based, high-fiber diet, this episode recognizes that you are what you eat, and in order to be healthy, you must eat quote-unquote healthy. The second half of this episode focuses on how medical specialists can cultivate a respectful and culturally safe environment for patients, both in the clinic and through research. So overall, I hope listeners can recognize and make connections to other podcast episodes in this series, thinking specifically about how diet in Indigenous communities are changing and why they're changing, and how this may impact health and well-being. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with Dr. Nap Hill. His deep passion for understanding the intricate world of the gut microbiome, in addition to his clinical expertise and research experience, are truly inspiring. Having recently completed his GI fellowship, Dr. Nap Hill brings a fresh perspective that resonates with the experiences of medical students today, which is particularly valuable for our audience of medical trainees. I can't wait to share with all of you the fascinating world of gastroenterology and the gut microbiome. Whether you're a medical professional, a student, or simply curious about the science of gut health, this episode has something for everyone. So let's dive in and explore this exciting topic together. Welcome to Dr. Estello Nap Hill. Thank you so much for joining the Just Medicine podcast today. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today to get to know more about you, your work in gut microbiome research and clinical practice, and how, as a gastroenterologist, you work to create an inclusive and safe space for diverse patient populations. Without further ado, let's jump right in. To start off, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your role?
Okay, so my name's Estello Nap Hill. I guess I'll be a 4th year gastroenterology fellow come July. And I started with an interest in the gut microbiome in medical school. I went to medical school here at UBC. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to deepen that interest, to do research, to partake in gut microbiome basic lab work, to get some publications, and to do some education and teaching on the topic. And so I'm excited to be here to share my passion and some of the things I've learned throughout that process. And I hope to incorporate the gut microbiome, whether it's future kind of advances in it, utilizing it for healthcare, continuing to study with it, or just providing patient education and about it into my practice and into the future practices of upcoming doctors.
Awesome. So it sounds like you got started in gut microbiome research and became interested in it very early on in your career. I'm curious, what actually piqued your interest about the gut microbiome in the beginning?
So I think there was a article I came across on the internet that was looking at mice, and they had two uh, different phenotypes of mice. One was a obese phenotype, and one was a lean phenotype, and they switched the gut microbiome of the obese one with the lean one, and the lean one with the obese one, and they had these really stark photos that showed that these incredibly large mice became skinny, and these incredibly skinny mice became large. And that was the first thing that piqued my interest. And after that, I started reading more and more studies about it, started reading books like what is the gut microbiome? How does it work? And I've continued to be amazed by some of the research that comes out and some of the proposed um, connections that this might have in our bodies and in our physiology.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing about the mice. The fact that, transplanting one mouse's gut microbiome into the other could have such significant impacts on, their physiology or their health outcomes. I'm curious, we will get into more of a discussion on the gut microbiome, but before we move into that discussion, I'd love to know, what's your favorite food?
Oh, okay. What's my favorite food? I would have to say my favorite food is probably burritos, if I'm being honest. It's not necessarily from a perspective of like this is the healthiest food for your gut microbiome. I just have a pretty sentimental connection with burritos. It got me through my undergrad when I was at McGill. I just had fond memories of, you know, eating a lot of burritos to get me through long days of studying and whatnot. And since then, I've become vegetarian. So my burritos that I eat today look a lot different than they did in the past, but it's still kind of like a pretty sentimental favorite food. And the thing that I love about them, I guess, pertaining to the gut microbiome, is that you can fit a whole bunch of things into them all at once. And we'll get into that a little bit, but whether it's like rice, beans, corns, salsa, guacamole, fresh onions, and things like that. I'll talk a little bit about the importance of having a diverse range of whole foods in your diet, and a burrito is a pretty easy way to get all those in one place.
You're right. It's a beautiful thing. That tortilla is a simple vessel for so many different kinds of nutrient-packed foods. You can get your fat, proteins, and carbohydrates all in one place. So thanks for sharing that with us. Like I said, now we'll get into the meat of our discussion, pun intended. Let's talk about the gut microbiome. Just to start us off in a few sentences, what is the gut microbiome?
Okay, so the best place to start is just like what is the microbiome in general. And so when we say the microbiome, we refer to all of the microorganisms that are in our body. And so this includes all of the viruses, all of the fungi, all of the bacteria within the human body. And we focus a lot on the gut microbiome because the majority of those, somewhere around 90-95% of those, are found in our gut. And at this point, we are able to study bacteria the best. And by and far, bacteria outnumber things like fungi. But actually, there's more viruses than bacteria, but we just suspect that they either have less of a role or that we're just unable to study them at this time. So when we talk about the gut microbiome, right now we're really talking about the bacteria that are colonized in our intestinal digestive tract.
Okay. So it sounds like there's so many different types of microorganisms, viruses, fungi, bacteria. I guess, would you say that we know the most about the bacteria that exist in our gut at the moment?
Definitely.
All right. So with that, I'd love to hear an example of an organism, bacteria or not, and its pathway that's critical to human functioning. Like, how do these organisms actually interact with our body systems?
Yeah, so one of the, I guess, most studied or most common organism or genus species is Lactobacillus. Um, these are found in our gut, and their role has to do with a lot of digestive things, so such as helping to ferment and digest indigestible fibers. Um, and this specific lactobacillus and some of them like lactobacillus rhamnosus have been studied quite a lot and are used in like probiotics and a lot of probiotic yogurts and things like that. And it would suggest that they help with this digestion. There's also studies to suggest that these bacteria help with immune teaching, immune kind of reconstitution in the gut, kind of showing our guts what's pathogen versus what's not a pathogen. It's also been used in like things like preventing diarrhea in some cases, and so that would be one example.
Interesting. So, lactobacillus and other bacteria in our bodies teach our immune systems what is self and what is foreign or possibly problematic.
Yeah, they kind of exist if you kind of think microscopically to the the gut lining. It's one of the thinnest intersections between our kind of like sterile internal world and the outside world, because the digestive tract is actually just a continuation of your bum. It's it's not sterile any way through, but if you're like within your abdominal cavity, within your blood, all this kind of stuff, that's a that's a sterile place where there shouldn't be any bacteria or anything like that. And the gut microbiome sits on the epithelial lining of the intestines, and in that space there's the bacteria, then there's also a mucus layer, and then there's the epithelial layer, and in that epithelial layer and the mucus there's a lot of immune cells. And so the gut microbiome is kind of like this resident system where they're showing, okay, this is a good bacteria, it can kind of hang out in this space. Oh, this is a bad bacteria, it shouldn't. And that's really important, especially in childhood and infant development, for the development of a healthy immune system.
Okay, I'm curious, does that mean that the infant microbiome would look different from an adult or older aged microbiome?
It does. So going back to this mention about the difference between things being sterile and colonized, when we're all the way to the beginning of the development of a human, when you're in the womb of the mother, that's also considered a sterile environment. And so there's some research that may or may not suggest that there's like a couple bacteria or not, but by and large, there's no bacteria um, within the womb. And then at birth, already you have a distinction in the difference in colonization of the baby. So there are a lot of studies to show that if you have a child who's born vaginally, there that's where the bacterial colonization already starts. So there's a whole bunch of bacteria in the vaginal canal, but also the vaginal canal is kind of close to the rectum area, and so you get the initial colonization of gut microbes then, and then following that, when baby starts to breastfeed, there's another colonization of gut microbiome, of gut microbes. And the microbes that a breastfeeding baby has are specifically, their function is to help digest some breast milk and some of those enzymes in there. And you see that that's reflected in the type of species that you have. If a child is born through a C-section, studies have shown that the initial bacterial signature they have reflects more the skin flora than it does the vaginal and the initial gut stuff. This then does change, and it also goes to reflect the digestion of either breast milk or formula milk. That'll also make a difference. But those are all big distinctions at the beginning of life that will kind of are the first steps in the development of the microbiome. The next big step is usually happens around the introduction of solid foods. And you see another shift where the gut microbiome changes from having this primary function of helping to digest the milk to starting to develop some of the features that you would see in an adult microbiome that will help to digest plant foods, meats, etc., and things like that. And then the general kind of overall pattern of the microbiome from that point onwards is relatively stable. And you see kind of an increase in diversity. And we'll talk about some of the features that'll affect the gut microbiome. But at this point, it's kind of considered more or less the adult microbiome. And then again, at kind of as we age and go into the elderly stage of life, you see another shift in the gut microbiome, and it becomes a little less diverse. And then there's kind of like the aged microbiome that we see. So those, I would say, are the factors: the microbiome at birth, transitioning into eating a adult diet, the adult microbiome, and then the elderly one.
That's so interesting. I guess what I'm extracting from that is that your gut microbiome's development depends on what you're exposed to. I do have a question about delivery and breastfeeding and their importance to developing an infant's microbiome. If a baby is delivered by C-section and or doesn't breastfeed, are they able to recover the microbiome diversity that they would have otherwise lost out on?
So it's definitely possible to recover. I've seen some studies that'll look at when the baby comes out, for example, they will kind of use like the sponges to expose the baby to some of the vaginal juices and whatnot at that time to try and mimic the exposure of that. And the other thing is that initial colonization itself is very trans and dynamic as well. So it's not like that initial one then sticks around with you forever. It's something that has a high turnover rate. And so I do think it is possible. And there's just so many factors that go into determining what it'll be at that time. Like, for example, if the baby develops sepsis and needs to receive antibiotics versus if they don't, do they need to go to the NICU? Like, there's a lot of things that are going to drastically affect it that haven't been studied. So I'd imagine that there are definitely ways that it'll bounce back in certain situations.
Right, that makes sense. You sort of touched on it, but I'd love to explore what the other key factors are that shape your gut microbiome. So just now you mentioned antibiotics. Are there other key factors that are important for the development of your gut microbiome?
Yeah, so there are quite a lot of factors that affect the gut microbiome. I think the biggest one that we have control over is our diet. So diets, whether the amount of fiber versus kind of like high sugar, high fat diets, whether or not you're eating fermented foods, prebiotics foods, which are kind of foods high in non-digestible fibers that are fibers that the gut bacteria have to eat, are all going to affect the gut microbiome. And so to sum that up, high fiber, whole food, plant-based foods are going to be good for the gut microbiome to help develop a diverse and healthy gut microbiome, where diets high in sugar, processed foods, high fat diets will lead to more less diverse and potentially more harmful microbiomes. Medications are a big one. So antibiotics are like nukes to the gut microbiome. So they'll drastically decrease the diversity in population there. But they're not the only medications. Proton pump inhibitors are also really bad for the gut microbiome because it drastically changes the chemical characteristics in the GI tract. And so that change in pH will affect it and can lead to dysbiosis as well. And it's actually quite associated with C. diff colonization and infection. And then another one to consider is NSAIDs, although less studied and less less big there. I mentioned already birthing, so the birth method, the type of infant feeding, and then just age. So, from breastfeeding to eating regular foods and then into the elderly stages of our life. That's another big factor that affects it. Our geography and our environment is super important. So studies show that people living in urban areas have less diverse microbiomes than people who are living in rural areas. And this probably has to do with the amount of exposure to nature, soil, animals, affecting that. Lifestyle factors are really important as well. So activity levels, whether you're exercising, getting outside, those things have been shown to lead to more diverse gut microbiome. Whereas things like increasing stress, poor sleep schedules, I might even add medical residency, will lead to a less diverse microbiome. Some people have suggested in studies that genetics have a factor as well, but at the same time, they've done some twin studies and stuff that have looked at people with the same genetic profiles, and they found that environment is much more important than genetics in determining the factors of the gut microbiome. And then illness, so infections, getting a bacterial infection or a viral infection of the gut will change the gut microbiome, and chronic diseases as well. So with chronic diseases, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg. We see that in chronic disease states, there are kind of what we call gut dysbiosis or kind of like pathologic gut microbiomes. But it's impossible at this time to say whether or not those patterns of gut microbiomes are a consequence of the disease or contributing to the disease. We just kind of see that there's an association there.
Wow. Sounds like there's a number of different things, some in your control, some not in your control. When you think about nature versus nurture, nature being your genetics, but like you said, not being as important as nurture, things like the diets that you're consuming, whether you're able to have a vaginal delivery or medications that you take, the environment that you live in. It's pretty amazing how so many different factors can shape the, viruses, fungi, and bacteria that are living in your intestines. I guess kind of bringing us back to diet, how might gut microbes of people who follow more of a traditional or hunter-gatherer style diet differ from gut microbes of people who follow more of a westernized diet? I just kind of wanted to distill that down just to give a really good idea to our listeners.
So I think the single most important thing is the amount of plant-based whole food fiber. So if you think about a more traditional diet, the number one thing is that all the foods that they're eating are whole foods. Right. They're not eating anything that's processed. Everything is a whole food. The amount of fiber is going to be a lot more, whether it's like the grains that they're eating that are unprocessed with the whole grain involved. It's not just the ultra processed wheat or flour. There are, fruits, vegetables, all these things. are whole foods and plant-based, and that's been the thing that's shown to increase the bacterial diversity and lead to the most healthy gut microbiome. And if you contrast that to like standard American diet, you see a lot more ultra processed foods. You see the fiber content drastically decreased, and those are some of the most harmful things that you can do to the gut microbiome.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe phasing out these more traditional or hunter-gatherer style diets may prove to have a negative impact on the gut microbiome and the diversity or health of that gut microbiome.
Mhm.
How does that loss of diversity affect health status and health outcomes? Like specifically, I've come across some research that indicates an interaction between the gut microbiome and metabolism, neuropsychiatric and endocrine functioning. Could you speak to any of those interactions to demonstrate the importance of a balanced microbiome for overall human health?
Yeah, so I would say that the most obvious place that has been studied or is apparent is with C. diff infections, because that's one condition where we know that it's specifically a dysbiosis, or it's a imbalance of the bacteria in our gut, and we get an overproduction of, or we get an overcolonization of C. diff, and then that leads to an infection. Like that's studied. That's the pathophysiology of that disease. That's very obvious. All of the other areas where we suspect that there is a role of gut dysbiosis in health and disease are a little more speculative, just in the sense that there's so many moving parts, but there are quite a lot of other suspected situations that are connected. So the first one you mentioned there is like the gut-brain axis. So we think that the gut microbiome it has a role in the production of neurotransmitters, things like serotonin, things like GABA, that affects mood and cognition. And so dysbiosis their suspicion, people suspect that it'll have a role in mental health and things like that. The other is the gut liver axis. So the gut microbes and some of these short chain fatty acids that they secrete and their role in bile acid metabolism are thought to kind of affect the liver axis, affect things like glucose production and storage, and contributions to things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Furthermore, the immune axis. So I mentioned earlier that the gut microbiome had a role to kind of like sit at the junction between the outside world and our inside world. And so you can imagine, if we don't have a very robust or healthy microbiome, that immune development phase and that immune education phase is going to be suboptimal, and it suspects that can lead maybe to like immune system overreaction, overregulation, kind of excess allergies, potentially some autoimmune conditions. There's also kind of gut skin access. So our skin microbiome is super important. Diseases like eczema, psoriasis, acne, they suspect that there's a gut microbiome or skin microbiome component to that as well. And then this is also thought to be primarily through immune signaling pathways. I mentioned a little bit about metabolism. And then there are other studies that try to link the gut access to cardiovascular health. And so there are particular things that have been looked at to kidney health as well. But I think we're kind of at a phase where more research is required before we're able to say that there's a very distinct relationship. I think that overall, the lesson is that there seems to be a lot of connections coming from the gut microbiome and connecting to all sorts of different body systems. But we're at a phase where it's more about understanding those connections rather than attributing them in a causality or kind of direct cause and effect type way.
Right. I guess sort of what you were saying earlier, chicken or the egg. Is it the gut microbiome that's causing chronic disease, or is it chronic disease that's causing that dysbiosis? That's peculiar. And definitely something to consider further. I guess what I'm wondering now, once you do have dysfunction or once you're beginning to see negative health outcomes and you're thinking they're coming from an unhealthy gut microbiome, what kinds of treatments are available to get better?
So I think just like the approach to many kind of cognitive, many chronic diseases, many diseases in general, like it starts with the, I guess, non-pharmacologic things. And so in this case, it's no different. It's diet. And so addressing what does your diet look like? What is the amount of fiber intake, whole food, plant-based things that you're eating? Are you eating a lot of processed foods, all of those kind of things? And so if somebody were to completely revamp their diet, they're already going to start to see a lot of changes in their gut microbiome towards a beneficial one. And I say that with a caveat because, not every person is the same and not every microbiome is the same. And so while some people may feel that they are feeling like they're best eating a vegan diet, some people may argue that eating meat makes them feel better and whatnot. And so the studies will suggest that it's whole food plant fibers that are best for the gut microbiome. But I'm sure there are worlds that exist where it's not necessarily that, but we would suggest that it's the non-digestible fibers and it's the diversity of plant foods that you're eating that are going to be the most healthy for your gut microbiome. The other non-pharmacologic things are going to be exercise, spending time in nature. It's affected by the people that you hang out with, all these kind of things that you're doing. Moving on, then it would be like, okay, like pharmacologic things or interventional things. The biggest thing there would be avoiding unnecessary exposures to medications, unnecessary exposures to antibiotics, unnecessary like deprescribing of things like PPIs if they're not indicated. And then all the way on the like extreme axis of things, people do things like microbiota transplant, fecal microbiota transplant, and that is what it involves, like actually taking the stool microbiome or some distilled version of that from somebody else who you've presumed has a healthy gut microbiome, and then transplanting that into another person and with the hopes of colonizing that. And now I should mention as well, along the more like pharmacologic or interventional route, there's things like prebiotics, there's things like probiotics, there's a whole host of like supplements and things like that that are all being studied and trying to look at their effects on the gut microbiome. So there's a few things you can do.
Wow. Wow, that fecal transplant, that was creative. Hey, I wonder how they came up with that one.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing with that is it's not a new thing at all. Like if I think I can't remember quite exactly off the top of my head, but it's something that's being practiced like all the like hundreds and thousands of years all the way back. I don't know if like thousands of years, but I
Wow.
think it's been something that's been in very ancient traditional practices for a very long time. And we've just developed the scientific vocabulary and knowledge to be able to talk about it in a kind of like medical way in the recent years and decades. But I think it's absolutely fascinating that it has been around for a really long time. And you also see like certain animals that have done similar things to kind of develop certain resistances to diseases or certain kind of like specific adaptations to environments. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess it just took time for Western medicine to adopt the fecal transplant. And I guess there was a certain level of scientific evidence that needed to be gathered for that to be acceptable in, I guess, our, again, Western medicine. But it's funny, I actually grew up with two dogs and they eat each other's poop. So, like you say, it's not like animals and humans haven't been doing it for hundreds or thousands of years.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to unpack there.
For sure. So I guess just pivoting, as you know, this podcast is called Just Medicine, kind of taking a social justice and health equity lens to many different topics. So I wanted to transition into a conversation about your role as a physician in clinical relationships and research interactions with patients. I guess sort of to start us off, looking more clinically, in this podcast series, we're interviewing two other experts in Indigenous healthcare. There's exists a level of systemic discrimination that continues to affect Indigenous folks in medicine, and that, in combination with a lot of historical mistreatment, leads to ongoing mistrust. Not only that, but my understanding is that a lot of the care provided to Indigenous patient populations utilizes a Western approach that's not always culturally appropriate. So when it comes to food and diet, many Indigenous communities have cultural practices associated with traditional foods. Many of these communities lack access to these foods and practices. What do you do as a gastroenterologist when someone comes in with a disease that requires dietary counseling? And I guess, how can you and other medical trainees make counseling culturally appropriate for these populations?
Hmm. I think that the best approach to that would be to have a interdisciplinary collaborative approach. So I think that focusing on your expertise and providing the best knowledge or recommendations that you have is what you can do from the perspective as a medical expert, and then utilizing the resources like Indigenous health teams and collaborating with them in conjunction with dietary, nutritional counselors and teams, I think would be the best way forward, rather than presuming that your way is the only way to do it, kind of including them in the discussion and including them in the development of a care plan that's going to facilitate the most inclusive care for the patient, I think would be the way to go forward.
Totally. I'm curious, do you see that currently in your own medical practice? Do you see that, an Indigenous health dietitian or Indigenous health navigators are incorporated into the medical team?
There are definitely Indigenous health teams within the hospitals that we utilize and consult whenever we have patients coming in from an Indigenous background, especially if they've requested that. I would say that along the lines of specifically integrating that within the dietary recommendations and integrating that within that multidisciplinary approach, I probably don't see that often. And that's probably something that would either be pursued independently by the patient rather than upfront being a part of the multidisciplinary team. So there may be a role to have a more have a Indigenous representative more at the kind of forefront of that, rather than having to seek out, let's say we make dietary recommendations for somebody with celiac disease. We don't necessarily have a Indigenous dietitian. We have a dietitian and then an Indigenous kind of community person. So there's definitely room to create more of an integrative approach there.
Right, right. And find somebody who's sort of at the intersection of both those niches.
Yeah, because I think it requires, a level of expertise in the cultural things that we can't expect we would have to go out of our way to be educated on that, to be able to provide culturally specific knowledge. And so I think that you would have to consult an expert in order to learn yourself and in order to be able to provide the best recommendations.
100%. And every community is different, and every, traditional diet is different. And so I think you're right. If there were more people who were kind of brought into those roles, that could prove very beneficial to diverse patient populations who are coming in to see you. As for my next question, I guess sort of looking more broadly at just justice and equity in medicine, how do you navigate inequity when you see it? What is your role as a physician, specifically as a specialist, in standing with patients against injustice?
So I think that we see a lot of injustice and marginalized communities within healthcare. And I think that first and foremost, your role is to provide unbiased care to everybody that you see, and to provide the same level of kind of care and compassion and expert, like the care to the best of your ability, regardless of the patient and of the situation. Respecting people's, I think non-judgment is another important factor of that. So not judging patients for how or why they've presented, but treating them regardless and doing and kind of advocating for them on that behalf. And then trying to implement like harm reduction strategies is also important, while acknowledging that even if those harm reduction strategies don't work, and let's say somebody represents with this same issue or similar issue, starting back over at the beginning, focusing on compassion and care, non-judgment, and providing the best level of care that you can for those situations. I think that often in internal medicine and throughout residency, you will see that some of the more disadvantaged populations utilize a lot of the resources that you have to give, and that you have to conscientiously like show compassion and non-judgment and treat everybody with respect and treat everybody with the highest level of medical expertise that you can. And I think that often is something that requires like a conscious practice and reminding of yourself to do that.
For sure. Recognizing that there are so many other factors that impact whether or not somebody requires or seeks healthcare as well.
Mm-hmm.
How does your identity shape the way that you interact with diverse patients?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess my own identity, I'm biracial. So my dad's African American, my mom's Dutch. And so my own perspective of identity has always been somewhat of a like race is the spectrum kind of thing. And so I look at a lot of situations interacting with patients and whatnot as trying to provide like culturally informed care and acknowledging that everybody comes from different backgrounds, because I've come from such a kind of mixed match background myself. Also in acknowledging like minorities. And so, for example, being Black in medicine and acknowledging that there are often not a lot of other Black physicians, and having the opportunity to be a representative of a minority in medicine allows me to connect with other minorities and to try and advocate for other minorities and to kind of keep that as important consideration whenever providing care. And so I kind of take some of those thoughts with me as I have gone through my medical training, and I try to advocate for equal opportunities to trainees from diverse background, but also equal access to care and equal um, care to patients from diverse backgrounds. And like you said, who may seek out medical care at different stages in their life or just have different access to different resources. And so I'm just kind of, when you have the opportunity to interact with somebody, taking that as like a crucial time to try and provide as much as you can.
Definitely. Yeah, to provide as much as you can and kind of, from what I'm hearing, build relationship. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like recognizing your position and then how to navigate your interactions and connections that you're building with patients. And then throughout that whole process, practicing empathy is something that you prioritize as a medical trainee or soon to be medical doctor. I guess sort of moving into the next phase of our conversation, um, just then we were speaking about your role as a physician in clinical practice. I'm curious on the flip side, to talk a little bit more about research interactions with patients. Again, sort of bringing it back to Indigenous patients, given that that is the topic of our podcast series. Many Indigenous patients and communities have been seriously harmed in the name of research and knowledge production. I'm curious what you think about how physicians can maintain trust with these patients and communities, given the historical context.
Yeah, that's, I think that with any research, uh, important part of research that we do today is that it's done in a way that doesn't provide harm to the research participants.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think another portion of that is kind of including the research participants in the kind of like just fully not disclosing what it goes into the research. And then in regards to specifically Indigenous populations, probably acknowledging that history and reconciling how ongoing research is going to benefit certain disease conditions and certain populations of people that are at risk for certain diseases, and how collaboration with the community and the research would be a opportunity to do that. And then, of course, providing always acknowledging that the research process is a consent-based process, and that at any point, if somebody decides to take part in a research project, that they can withdraw their consent, then they're fully informed of everything that goes into it, and also sharing the results of that research and connecting with the community and helping to kind of feedback that the effort and the work towards the research has gone to make a difference, and plugging that back into the community that helped to achieve the research results, I think are all important things to consider with that.
For sure. It was very interesting, actually. I was reading a paper that was talking about how Indigenous people across the world harbor microbiome signatures that are very different from Euro American populations, but it's these populations that dominate the research, so they're disproportionately included in the study population, and there kind of lacks research on the Indigenous gut microbiome. It's important to think through how Western clinical scientists and researchers can partner with Indigenous communities to learn more about their potentially unique gut microbiomes, and through this partnership, making sure to create equity and equalize power dynamics, as well as clearly indicate how the research will benefit the community. Looking more broadly at the research side of things, could you discuss some of the limitations of studying the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so it's a relatively new field of research, and I think that there are a lot of caveats to consider whenever looking at the research. Um, the first one being that the way in which we study the like the gut microbiome, as we've alluded to, it's incredibly complex. there's bacteria, fungi, viruses. Um, from a perspective of the biogeography of the intestinal tract, and I say that to mean like, okay, the chemical and physical characteristics of the stomach are very different than the large intestine, or very different than the small intestine. Um, so taking a fecal sample and looking at the bacteria there, and then generalizing that to the microbiota of the entire intestinal tract is short-sighted. And then also, when you actually look at the samples, the detail in which we can characterize the bacteria there, we're only seeing the bacteria that survive and then survive being frozen and all this kind of stuff. So I think there are a lot of things to consider when it comes to like actually like, okay, like the bacteria that we're getting from studies, is that representative of what's actually going on in the microbiome? That's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that, as I've alluded to a lot with these disease states and whatnot, is that it's relatively impossible to determine what has come first, whether it's a disease state or it's dysbiosis or changes in the gut microbiome. And so that's another thing to really consider, is this whole causation versus correlation, and to what degree we can actually make conclusions about the gut microbiome with the information that we're getting. Another level is that in addition to the actual bacteria and organisms, there is a whole signature of the metabolic effects of those organisms. And so I think that just looking at the different bacteria, we lose the knowledge about, okay, well, what is the gut microbiome as a whole metabolically producing? So if you were to lose one bacterial species, that might drastically change the overall metabolic production and function of the gut microbiome by changing the interactions between the bacteria. So it's not as simple as, oh, because you've lost species X, now the gut microbiome is different because that species isn't there. It might be different in a completely different way because of the synergistic or antagonistic effects of the relative species of bacteria. Like, it's all about the balance and the different representations of populations and how bacteria work together. So it's not only the absolute number, it's the function, it's the collaboration of them all together. So I think that those are all limitations that we're working towards being able to overcome, but aren't really there yet. And so I think that there are quite a lot of limitations. And another big limitation is that within the way that people study the gut microbiome, there aren't a lot of standardized practices. So a lot of different labs and different research groups will go about it in one protocol, but not all these protocols are the same. So being able to draw conclusions from the different results that different groups are getting becomes more challenging because of the different ways in which the research was undertaken.
Right.
So I would say that those are some of the limitations that come to mind: the causation versus correlation, the ability to actually look at what organisms are in the gut and in the specific areas of the gut, the ability to look at the actual function of the gut microbiome as a whole rather than just what organisms are in the gut microbiome, are all, and then the study techniques undertaken by the research groups are all, I think, like really big, important considerations whenever you're looking at gut microbiome research, and big things that are going to be looked at as future research goes on.
Right. And do you think that even if a study was to make conclusions about a particular population, it would be difficult to generalize those results to any other population because of that complexity and diversity of the gut microbiomes?
Totally. Yeah. Like I alluded to earlier, like every person, their gut microbiome is like a fingerprint. It's unique. It's crafted based off of all of the life experiences that you've had, foods you eat, medications you have, and the way your gut microbiome interacts with your body and the world around you may be completely distinct to the general populace. And also with the studies, we're going to get a conclusion that's based off of the summation of the data. But even within the data that they have, there are outliers. And there are people who exist on one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum. And it's such an individualized process and thing that I think before we can truly start making targeted generalizations or things like that, we'll also need a level of like understanding how a specific, like kind of more like personalized medicine type approach to it, and understanding how a person's specific microbiome interacts with themselves and the benefits or disadvantages that has. And I don't know if we're at that place yet.
Right. Wow. Yeah, it sounds like we've got a long way to go, but very exciting as it is kind of a new and emerging field of research, and there's so much to learn and so much to be challenged by. Just being mindful of time here, I just wanted to move into our final section of the podcast episode, just kind of looking at next steps and final takeaways for our listeners. My first question for you is, what would you suggest for medical trainees interested in getting involved in the field of gastroenterology or interested in learning more about the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so I think GI is a fantastic specialty, fantastic field. I think it's one of the most kind of expanding, broad fields of medicine. So if anybody's interested in gastroenterology, like I think reading up about it and seeing what a GI career is like, it's very procedural, although you also have to do internal medicine, which is very cerebral. So for me, I found that it was kind of like a specialty that was the best of both worlds when it came to practicing medicine and getting to do procedures in medicine. And like any trainee interested in a topic, whether it's shadowing or exposing yourself to the kind of daily practice, the bread and butter of the specialty, I think that's something that's super important. And then when it comes to the research, whether it's looking up interesting studies or stumbling across something that I did that really piqued my interest, that's a place to start. And getting involved with research, never be shy when it comes to emailing preceptors or emailing PIs. I've always found throughout my training that people are so generous when it comes to collaborating on projects or providing advice and helping you understand where you're at or what you're interested in, because I think everybody kind of remembers what it's like to be at that stage of, the undifferentiated medical student and people who had helped them along at that stage. And there's a big pass it on kind of feeling that I have with medicine. And so I'm always keen to mentor and help people along the way. And so those would be kind of some initial recommendations for that from my perspective.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing those recommendations. I think a lot of times students look up so much to the physicians they work with or shadow that we forget these amazing physicians have gone through the exact same challenges that we're going through. So it's great to hear that you and others engage with mentorship and supporting students through their training journeys. I'm sure that you've inspired and motivated lots of students along the way to pursue GI. So we're almost out of time, and I'll just ask you one last question. There are a lot of individuals who are listening to our podcast that are interested in advocacy work, and I was wondering if you had any strategies that trainees can use to make an impact.
Yeah. So in terms of advocacy, something that I believe in is that you gotta advocate in the way that you are, like your actions speak the loudest. And so advocating by the way you live your life, if you really believe in a whole food plant-based diet, that's how you should eat. If you believe in lifestyle and physical activity and all these things that are going to be positive things for your patients, those should be things that you're practicing for yourself. And I think that it starts with you, because then whenever you go to advocate for anything, it's coming from the heart, and it's coming from a genuine practice and passion for whatever it is that you're trying to advocate for. So I think that's first and foremost the most important thing, is that you should be, through your actions, advocating for what you're passionate about. And I think after that, it comes down to finding areas where you can get involved, having a keen interest, learning as much as you can, having that beginner's mindset whenever it comes to being able to, whether it's learn more about what you're passionate about or learn more about how you can help the disadvantaged populations you're trying to work with. Having a non-judgmental and kind of compassionate lens to everything that you take on. Those would be my recommendations for how to be a active advocate for anything really.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Do you have any final comments or takeaways that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah. So I guess my final comment on the gut microbiome is a question that I get asked quite often. And it's, how, if I need to eat for a healthy gut microbiome, like what would you recommend that I do? And something that I've learned and something that I share is pretty simple, and it's a rule that's easy to remember. And it's that the gut microbiome thrives off of a diverse source of whole food plant-based fibers. And to think about each different plant that you eat as a point, and to aim for 20 to 30 points a day. And so to say that in a different way is that you should be trying to eat 20 to 30 different whole foods, plant-based whole foods per day, to have a diverse, healthy gut microbiome. So that doesn't mean having like a plate of broccoli and a plate of cabbage and all this kind of stuff. It means cooking foods that have a wide range of things. It means using things like seasoning, fresh seasoning, creating salads or maybe even burritos and stuff like that with diverse plant sources. And to just keep that in mind. And I think that without having any sort of a prescriptive diet and rather just following this general rule, it'll be a recipe for success.
A recipe for success. That's awesome. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today, Dr. Nap Hill. You have an incredible level of expertise, and I really appreciated our conversation. I think there's some really great insights that learners can take away from this episode, including the burrito recommendation. And overall, it's just really reassuring to hear that there's somebody like you working to create a safe and inclusive space for diverse patient populations when it comes to gut health and the gut microbiome. So hopefully, and I know there will be, there are some learners that are inspired by this episode to go and learn more and to get involved.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'm my door is always open. I'm always happy to chat about the topic. And so I wish you guys all the best, and thank you so much for having me on the show today.
Of course, thanks so much. Take care.
Okay, bye.